Hello, welcome to How Do You Soccer? I'm your host, Kirsten Hayes, and we're continuing our discussion about college recruiting for women's Division I soccer with our guest, Margueritte Aozasa, and parents Susan Kane and Karine Palacios, both MVLA parents. Mm-hmm. And Margueritte is a coach, both an assistant coach at Stanford and a youth coach at MVLA. So we were just talking about the kinds of players that college coaches are looking for, and both in terms of character, and one of the questions that came in was, do college coaches recruit for specific positions? Or are they looking for the best player overall, or does it really vary? And then more about the character that you're looking for in a player.
Yeah, so like we kind of spoke about before, character is a huge thing, especially when you're recruiting players that are so young. Because I think personality and character can, in many ways, be more consistent than what they're able to do on the field. Mm-hmm. And usually, character is directly related to what they can do on the field, and in many ways, how greatly they'll improve from the time you recruit them to when they're going to join you in college. And so if I can see on the field, or any coach can see on the field, that a player is extremely hardworking, that they're determined, that they have good leadership qualities, that they seem motivated, stuff like that, that's going to then translate to what they do off the field and oftentimes result in them improving on the field. And so I think it's best to invest in character as opposed to perhaps skill, except for those special players. Obviously, there's special players across the country that have incredible technical skill or incredible brain for the game or whatever it is. The best players in the country have all those things. So have the character, have the skill, and have the intelligence. But I think a lot of coaches, especially with the majority of schools, are willing to invest in character. And so character is huge in terms of what coaches are looking for.
I think MVLA calls it triple threat or something, is what the kids were talking about. When the girls are younger, I hear a lot of parents talking about they're nice to each other. They're too nice to each other, and different from how the boys are playing. Do you see a lot of that? And so, in terms of looking at skill, are you discerning how tough they can be, or what kind of distinctions do you see?
I think like the buzzword you'll hear coaches use is like competitiveness.
Okay.
And there's a way to be the nicest player on the field and be the most competitive player on the field. And it doesn't mean you're chippy and doesn't mean you're fouling people and this and that, but there's a grittiness that can show even if, again, you're super nice.
Mm-hmm. Did you say greedy or gritty?
Gritty. Sorry. You don't have to be malicious by any means.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction with girls. Like they're worried that if they're crossing that line, I'm not considered nice or something like that.
No, there's a ton of that, and I think in many ways, unfortunately, because I think it hinders players, right? And there's a lot of some players that don't like confrontation. They're not huge on contact, and I would say one of the biggest differences between college soccer and club soccer is that physicality. Okay. So players have to be comfortable with that, and they have to be like, you're going to get hit every time you get the ball, and you're expected to do the same. Yeah. And it's not foul in college. Yeah. That's just soccer now. Uh-huh. And so I think when you look at players, now we're not looking, again, for the ones that are sliding in from behind or like doing stuff behind the scenes that refs aren't seeing. Like, that's not the stuff we look for. But it's like, are you sliding to block a shot? Right. Are you like doing whatever you can to draw a foul? Are you competing in the air even though it's a 50-50 ball, and you know what? You might get headed in the head, but like you're going for it. Yeah. Because that could be the difference in a game. Mm-hmm. And that kind of extra competitiveness, if you will, that extra edge, whatever you want to call it, I think that's a huge indicator of success in the college game.
Got it.
And do you recruit players, or do colleges in general recruit players by position a lot? Because one of the questions was, how can we tell whether in that year they need that particular position? And if not, do I move on?
Right. I think in some ways you have to, because you can't create a team of only defenders. At the same time, there's a ton of fluidity between positions in terms of what you may have played in club and what you will be playing in college. There's a ton of conversion. So some of the best forwards in club become some of the best outside backs in college. Or some of the best holding mids in club become some of the best center backs in college. And so you don't always recruit players, I think, to fill specific needs, because again, like we talked about, it's kind of a gamble. You don't know if at the next level they're going to be able to play in that role. I think the safest most colleges would agree, is to recruit soccer players. And there's a huge distinction, I think, in the world of soccer between like athletes and soccer players. Like you can have a great athlete, they might be limited in where they can play. Like
does that mean speed?
Yeah, they're
mostly?
speed, they're fast, they're strong, but do they understand the game? Now, a soccer player can play almost anywhere. They may be better some places than others, but they can fill needs. And those, like that versatility, I think is extremely appealing, if you will, to coaches. And I think at MVLA, like that's something we really try to create is soccer players. And I think, like I know in my club experience, a lot of my friends and myself included, we played some position in club and went on and played something completely different in college. And that can be like, in our case, we played a 3-5-2 growing up. No coach in the country plays a 3-5-2 in college, and so we all became different things. Our outside mids became outside forwards or outside backs. I became a center back, even though I played a holding mid. Like, there's a lot of that, and I think what helped us is we were all versatile. And so there's a huge need for that. At the same time, one obviously like caveat is if you're a goalkeeper, you're probably going to be a goalkeeper. And that would be probably one of the only positions where coaches have to recruit by position, obviously. And I compare it to like quarterbacks in college. Very rarely will you find a school that's going to recruit like top goalkeepers in back-to-back years because one of them's going to be sitting for 3 years, and that makes no sense. So you might recruit top goalkeepers every 2 years or every 3 years. So then there's some sort of kind of natural rotation where a freshman comes in, maybe sits her first year, but then plays for 3 years. Another one comes in, sits her first year, plays for 3 or whatever. It would not make sense to have like 2 great goalkeepers in 1 year because one's going to be sitting probably most of her career.
So what happens if somebody is recruited and they're in their freshman year and they're probably not playing, but they're freshman year, so that's maybe to be expected. Get a new coach and they're on scholarship, but it's not a fit with that new coach. Does that? I'm sure that happens, and so that's why the school matters. And then, but how does that affect their scholarship or?
So scholarships, some schools have different policies, but in terms of NCAA, scholarships are year by year.
Oh, okay.
And so a coach can't come in, and if a player, say, is on 80% or something, and the coach comes in winter, they can't do anything to that 80% until the next school year.
Okay. And so what about walk-ons then? And can you walk on in different years? And how often does that happen?
Walk-on,
in D1, the walk-ons is maybe.
So there's kind of different levels of walk-on, I guess, if you will. So there's what we would call a recruited walk-on, which is basically a player that you've recruited that just is not on any money. And then there's maybe what you call like a regular walk-on, and even that has tiers, I would say, that is not getting money and maybe was not heavily recruited. But there was contact between coaches. Oftentimes it can be something along the lines of like, if you get, it can contingent on their admission to school. So if you get into school, you can be on the team. But it's not like a supported application, if you will.
Got it.
So like they're not going to help you get into school, I guess you could say.
Whereas a recruited player, they
can support your application. And again, this is different for every single school across the country. Some more academically focused schools don't have a lot of pull in terms of admission. Other schools may. And
the pull might be partly just, okay, we're going to take your information, grades, and test scores and pass it by the admissions office to say, does it look like you can get in or not before we continue recruiting?
Yeah. So in many ways you could say some support is just kind of help guiding you to prepare the player to get into the school, which can be very helpful. But yeah, there's a lot of different kind of types of walk-ons. There's some schools may hold a tryout, like first week of training. And if you're in school, you can qualify to be on the team. If you make it, you make it. There's a lot. There's kind of a lot of variety, I guess you could say, across the country.
And people who sign, players who sign a national letter of intent, that's a specific contract with the school for that scholarship for the first year.
For the first year.
And then so there are players who've been recruited who don't sign those because they're not getting a scholarship.
Right.
And then players in their sophomore, junior year will verbally commit, and that's between the player and a coach, not the school.
Right. And
so the coach leaves, and then that sort of has to be
so verbal commitments are really tough because by NCAA rules, there can be nothing written, like no written contract until your senior year. So because of that, everything is verbal. And because of that, everything is basically honor code, which thankfully in women's soccer is pretty, everyone does a pretty good job of honoring those. In terms of, I think, players that are verbally committed generally don't continue to talk to other schools. Schools are generally very respectful of players that have already committed. There are some exceptions in the sense that if you're verbally committed to a school that doesn't guarantee acceptance or doesn't have a lot of pull in that, a lot of schools that are in that case also understand that and will tell players, like, have a backup plan because it's not guaranteed. And that happens across the country. And I think schools try to be understanding of that. Like, don't put all your eggs in one basket unless you have a very good chance of getting in. And for players that are perhaps questionable, I think they'll say, maybe have a backup plan. But if that is not the case, I think it would be frowned upon to have backup plans and continue talking to other schools. I think most schools would not like that so much. Just like I think most schools wouldn't like if a coach knows a player's committed and they still heavily recruit them. So there's a lot of kind of like unwritten rules, I guess you could say, about that. Now, like Kirsten was saying, the verbal commitment is really between you and the coach. If a coach leaves, a lot of coaches, I think, will honor verbal commitments. Some may not, but I think most will. But the player isn't necessarily bound to that either. So if they want to change their decision after a coaching change, I think that's pretty understandable.
So, excuse me, I'd be interested in a question. So if you're talking about trying to choose a school based on academics versus sports, maybe something you could do is describe what is the exact commitment that a college soccer player has, and how do they balance that with academics, and how intense is that compared to their club experience with school, say in high school?
Yeah, so I will say this, I think club players of today are pretty well prepared for their college commitment in terms of time, because most club players right now, like we have club players that may drive an hour to practice, so practice is now just not an hour and a half, now it's 4 hours. You have tournaments and you have showcases that last 5 days and you're missing school and there's a bunch of stuff. So I would think more than ever, club players are prepared for the college environment. At the same time, there's going to be a huge adjustment. And I think the biggest adjustment is how you're treated as a player, in the sense that results now really matter. And so if you're not performing, you're not going to play. And the other difference is the roster size is probably significantly bigger than what you're used to. So most club teams are probably 18 to 20 players. Most colleges are probably 28 to 30 players, something around there. And so in club, probably you play almost half your games if you're on the top 18, right? There might be some tighter games that you don't get minutes in, but overall you're going to play. In college, I would say 16 players-ish per year play consistently, and that leaves another 12 to 15 that don't play hardly at all. And so there's a huge discrepancy there. And that's one of the biggest differences between club and college. So going off of that, another big difference, and this is what I was telling my players, this is where I think finding the right fit is so important, because the difference between not playing in club and not playing in college is also very different. So not only do you not get to play in the games, but training sessions are structured in a way that starting players are doing one thing, non-starting players are doing something else. A team might have 28 players, only 22 get to travel. And so there are 6 trips during the year that you don't get to go on. And so you're at school when everyone else is gone. If you go to playoffs, it can be like 25 players get to sit on the bench. Well, that's 4 players that have to sit in the stands. Like, there's a lot of stuff that goes on that's just very different from club, in the sense of starters versus non-starters. And that's why I think, again, I emphasize to my players, like, it's so important to find the right fit. And if you're that 28th player freshman year, okay, that happens. But if you're going to be that 28th player for all 4 years, your experience is very different than the starting 11.
And probably the D1 schools, well, not probably, the D1 schools are picking all the best players who are used to playing all the time.
Right,
and
right.
that's a big transition.
Adjustment. That can be a huge adjustment.
Yeah.
And a lot of players, always talk to their coaches, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And I think coaches love that and appreciate that. At the same time, if they ask you to do something and you do it for 2 weeks, that doesn't mean you're going to start playing. Like that could be, you have to do this for now a year. And so I think it's very, just again, I can only emphasize it so many times, but it's so important to find a good fit from the beginning. And then also find a school where if you're not playing, you're going to be happy. But Susan, you had also asked just like the general schedule and kind of what players are getting into if they decide to play D1 soccer. So it's based on season. Okay. So typically during the year you have a competition season, an off season, and a non-competition season. The duration of those kind of depends by school, and it can depend on semester school versus quarter school, or however coaches want to devise their schedule. They have some control over that. In your competition season, you have probably 18 to 20 games. And then during the week, you have 20 hours of training, or 20 hours of commitment. And then within that, you have to have 1 day off. So generally speaking, you have something soccer related 6 days a week, and then 1 day off. During those 6 days, it can be anything from games, it can be training, it can be meetings, it can be individual meetings. And those are all things that what we would say are counted hours, so they're required of the team. Counted hours can also be individual training that some coaches may require of certain players.
Weight training is included?
Weight training is included also. What's not counted hours is what they do voluntarily, maybe on their own. So if they go to the training room, that doesn't count. If they go out 30 minutes before practice and hit long balls with another player without coaches there, that doesn't necessarily count. And so I say 20 hours, but that's really the minimum in many ways. In the off season, it's now limited to 8 hours. So there's a huge difference between your competition season and your off season. So in some quarter schools, off season may last the entire winter quarter. In some semester schools, it may last only a month. It may last 6 weeks. Like coaches have some control over that. And during that 8 hours, 2 of which right now can be with the ball. The other 6 are usually weight training or running or weights and conditioning, whatever you want to call it. There is legislation right now kind of aiming to change that so that the 8 hours can be soccer related, because in many ways I think it's a little counterintuitive. They do it to protect the athletes, and I think that's very important because during the competition season, obviously, there's a huge time commitment. But by doing so, I think it's structured in a way that it's actually harder on the athletes because now you're running for 6 hours as opposed to playing. And I think most athletes would prefer to just play soccer for those 6 hours. But I understand kind of why that was written. And then you move into your non-competition season. So that's the spring for most places. During that time, you can go back to maximum 20 hours a week. But rather than 18 to 20 games, now you have 5 game days. And so you could play as many games as you want on those days. Most places will only play 1 game. If they have a huge squad, they might play 2 games on those days. And so that's kind of the difference. The time commitment is much less in the spring because competition and travel takes up a huge chunk of time in the fall. So during spring, you can only drive to games. So everything has to be within driving distance, which greatly limits the travel schedule. And so most are, an hour or whatever, within an hour. Here in the Bay Area, it's great because there's so many schools you can play within probably an hour and a half drive. But other places, you might be doing some road trips.
And you're studying travel.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. One big difference that's important for kids to recognize is the difference in terms of soccer schedule between quarter system and semester system. So most quarter schools are going to start mid to late September. Most semester schools are starting sometime in August. Most schools, Division I, in terms of soccer, are going to start August 1st or something right around there. And so for quarter schools or schools that are starting late September, you're going to do half your season before school starts, which from a student standpoint can be great.
Yeah.
Because a lot of your, that's your non-conference schedule. Your non-conference schedule tends to be farther in distance than your conference schedule. And so if you're on the West Coast, that might be an East Coast trip, that might be a trip to the Midwest. That's all going to be done before school starts, so you're not missing anything.
Nice.
In many ways, you're like a pro athlete for 6 weeks because all you're worried about is soccer. Semester school, you'll have 2 weeks probably during preseason, which you're doing double days, and then right when your double days stop, your school's going to start. And so you're going to be just extremely busy the entire season, as opposed to quarters. You're only extremely busy with school and soccer for about half your season. On the flip side, quarter system tends to get out in mid-June. Semesters get out in May. So you can make up that free time in the summer, but it's a trade-off. I think in academically focused schools and academically strenuous schools, the quarter system can be really appealing because you're not going to miss a lot of class, relatively speaking.
So that's one thing to look at when you're looking at
Yes, I think that's something
great.
to ask yourself, or just, again, know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Just be educated.
So I have some detailed questions about players reaching out to coaches.
Oh,
so
yeah, go ahead.
One thing that's come up is players, I guess, should create an email address for themselves that might have their name or their club or their number or their graduation year or something in it. And then also, what should they put in the subject line? Because coaches are getting thousands of emails. How can they help? How can that subject line help them sort through it?
Right. So in terms of email addresses go, I would advise this. If you want to make one just for recruiting that says your name and grad year, great. Not necessary, but great. But I would stay away from the like Happy Girl 247 or something like that. That gives zero indication of who you are, because that can be really hard, and we get those sometimes. Also, when players email us from their parents' email, like one of the questions that you guys had was like what we look for in players, and I think coaches across the country look for players that are self-sufficient and mature, because when you go to college, your parents don't get to go with you, and so that's huge. And so I always direct my players to make sure that they are the point of contact, and that's very clear, because again, coaches aren't recruiting parents, they're recruiting the actual player. But if you were to make one, I would say probably like including your grad year and your name is probably the most efficient thing to do. In terms of subject line, I think it's coach's preference. I'm sure there's coaches in the country that like the kind of different taglines. Other coaches I don't think care. I would say like if you want to include your name, grad year, and perhaps your club team, those are probably good indicators for coaches. That kind of makes it easier for them to quickly look at the level of the player.
So
like a quick glance.
Name, grad year, not position, but
you can
teams,
do like club team and position. Those are probably things. I don't think you need to include anything beyond that.
Right.
And then in the email, often you're talking about sending an email before a showcase or something, and so it seems like the specifics of here's the games I'm going to play in and what times and where.
Yeah.
Is it important to also include, I know a little bit about your school, here's what I know about it, or is it they're just coaches are looking through so many emails?
Yeah, I'll say this. There are a couple things that I would steer clear of, just generally. One would be a mass email to a ton of coaches, because it's very easy to tell which emails were written just as like a template. And I think coaches would appreciate just a little time and effort. Also, don't like CC like 50 coaches, because that's another one where coaches are like, okay, thank you. I'll be there with these other 50 coaches. Sounds good, thank you. So make it something personal. It doesn't have to be like, I loved that game you played and under the lights and it was raining and this and that. It can be like, I really am interested in your academic program, or I love the balance at your school between academics and athletics. It doesn't have to be something corny. Just something somewhat personal that shows that you've done a little research, and that it's not just you haven't just chosen the school off a list.
And what about which coaches? So some schools have.
Yeah, I would say email their whole coaching staff.
Okay.
So that might usually that's 3 to 5 coaches, a head coach and assistants, grad assistants if there are. I don't think it hurts to email all of them, because each school is going to be different in terms of who kind of the point of contact is for recruits. At some schools it might be the head coach, at some schools it might be the assistant, at some it might be the grad assistant. So you cover all your bases if you just address all the coaches.
And then should players CC their club coach? Or that depends on what the club coach wants?
I think it depends on the club coach. I encourage players to always include the club coach's contact information because obviously schools cannot contact the player, or most schools, if they're young enough, they can't contact the player. If you want to do that through CC or just including their email address at the bottom, I don't think there's a difference.
What about filling out the recruiting questionnaire on the college websites?
That can be really helpful because that saves time for coaches.
In what way?
Usually it goes into a database.
It pre-fills their database.
If not, then we have to do it manually,
Okay.
which is fine too, but it does save time for coaches. So I think there's no harm in doing that.
Okay. And at what age? Just as soon as they're emailing, also do that? Okay.
As soon as they've kind of identified the school as something they're interested in.
Okay. And then at showcases, often teams will have a profile sheet with all the players and interests. Are there certain things that are advantageous to have on it? Certain things that are just extra? Is paper no longer used?
I think paper is still very prevalent because a lot of coaches, there's just some that feel more comfortable getting a handout than carrying around their iPad or whatever it is. So paper is totally fine. I've heard some coaches prefer paper they can write on.
Yeah.
So sometimes you get
glossy.
like shiny cardstock, and understand coaches are shoving these into your backpack or writing quick notes on them, and so
just regular paper.
Yeah, paper is great. Sometimes they include like a little notes section, which can be helpful also. But key things to include would be obviously like a picture of the player. That just helps with recognition and familiarity. Their full name, GPA, position, whether or not kids are already committed, because sometimes as a coach that can be really frustrating. You might love a player and then you find out later they're already committed. So if the player is committed, make sure you note that. And then contact information. Whether or not they can email you, at least you know what you're looking for.
What high school they go to doesn't matter.
You can
the
include
name
which
of it,
high school.
But it's not, GPA is
GPA
enough
is probably
to say.
bigger than that, yeah.
I think graduating year is really important
And
now
grad
that we've
year.
split the years
Yes.
because people are carrying people of multiple years, right?
The last thing to include perhaps is like individual or team accolades, because it kind of just gives coaches a heads up.
A sense of what the
sense of the
team is
players
like.
and the team,
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on
That
this
was
Thank
great.
you so
No
much.
problem.
episode of How Do You Soccer?
I learned
Start
a
over.
ton. Start over.
Yeah.
And come back and join us again for How Do You Soccer next episode. Thank you.